Long before the first empires carved their names into stone, humanity waged an unrecorded war against an adversary far more merciless than any rival tribe or predatory beast. Our battlefield was not a walled city or a blood-soaked frontier, but the changing atmosphere itself. For tens of thousands of years, the sky held the power to eradicate entire generations without warning or remorse. Monsoons that had sustained vast grasslands for centuries could suddenly falter and fail, leaving behind cracked mud and sun-bleached skeletons. Continental ice sheets crawled southward, locking up global moisture and transforming lush forests into barren, frozen steppes. Volcanic supereruptions hurled sulfur and ash into the stratosphere, dimming the sun and plunging unfamiliar worlds into sudden, multi-year winters. Yet through every ecological collapse, our fragile, hairless ancestors managed to endure. We did not survive because we were the swiftest runners on the savanna, nor because our jaws were equipped with predatory fangs. We lacked the thick, insulating fur of the mammoth, the armored hide of the rhinoceros, and the natural cold tolerance of Arctic predators. Our bodies were biologically forged under the radiant, tropical sun of East Africa, engineered for heat dissipation through sweat rather than endurance against the frost. If physical strength alone had governed the fate of living creatures, our lineage would have been extinguished in its earliest millennia. Instead, our ancestors weaponized something far more formidable than biological armor: the capacity to reshape behavior across a single generation. Where other species required hundreds of thousands of years to mutate, human beings adapted at the speed of thought. The story of human survival is not a triumphant, unbroken march forward, but a series of desperate improvisations conducted beside dying waterholes and beneath darkening skies. It begins across the dynamic landscapes of Pleistocene Africa, an environment that was never the static paradise modern imagination often constructs. Deep beneath the surface of the continent, tectonic forces split the earth, creating profound rift valleys, jagged volcanic peaks, and massive, temperamental lake systems. Over astronomical timescales, subtle wobbles in Earth's orbit shifted the reach of the tropical monsoons, cycling the continent between phases of abundant moisture and catastrophic aridity. A basin that rippled with deep, fish-rich water for 40 generations could slowly shrink into a shallow, alkaline swamp within 40 years. The Great Sahara itself pulsed like a giant lung, breathing lush green savannas into existence during wet phases, only to swallow them beneath choking sands when the rains retreated. For early Homo sapiens, these planetary rhythms were not abstract scientific phenomena, but immediate matters of life and death. Imagine a band of 30 people waking to the gray dawn beside a shrinking body of water in the East African interior roughly 150,000 years ago. The ground around their temporary brush shelters is trampled and white with salt deposits left behind by retreating waves. In the center of the camp, an elder stirs the glowing embers of a small hearth, adding fragments of acacia wood that hiss and smoke into the cool morning air. A mother draws her shivering child closer to the warmth, glancing out toward a muddy expanse that was once a thriving shoreline teeming with reeds and waterfowl. The oldest among them can remember a time when the water reached the base of the distant basalt hills, supporting vast herds of zebra, wildebeest, and giant buffalo. But the children of this band have known only dust, blistering journeys between dwindling seeps, and the sour taste of brackish springs. In this quiet, unrecorded moment, the band faces the ancient dilemma that has defined the migration of our species from the beginning: stay with the diminishing known, or gamble everything on the unknown. Remaining by the drying lake offers the comfort of familiarity, the knowledge of every rock shelter, and the presence of ancestral burial sites. Yet the daily walks to find food are stretching from hours into full days, and the game herds are no longer passing through their traditional ambush points. Moving requires carrying infants, fragile tools, and nursing mothers across sun-baked terrain where a single navigational error means death by dehydration. There are no maps, no scout reports, and no certainty that fresh water exists beyond the shimmering heat mirages on the horizon. To make such a choice demands more than desperation. It requires the mobilization of collective memory and shared social intelligence. An older woman speaks, recalling a distant valley her own grandfather once described during an earlier season of drought, where cold water bubbled from limestone fissures beneath a sacred ridge. Her memory is not merely folklore. It is an invisible technology of survival, a cognitive map passed across generations by spoken word. While biological evolution is tethered to the slow cadence of reproduction, cultural inheritance allows information to defy the lifespan of the individual. The band decides to move, packing their flaked stone blades, grinding slabs, ostrich eggshell water containers, and prepared pigments into lightweight leather wraps. They set out across the parched basin, reading the sky not for celestial beauty, but for the subtle moisture cues written in towering cumulus clouds miles away. Every footprint left behind in the hardening silt marks another step in humanity's ongoing escape from ecological determinism. Survival was never achieved by dominating nature, but by mastering the art of the retreat, the pivot, and the relocation. What separated these early foragers from every other predator stalking the Pleistocene savannas was the immense breadth of their dietary flexibility. A specialized carnivore such as the saber-toothed cat or the giant hyena was bound entirely to the abundance of specific prey animals. If climate disruption forced large ungulates to migrate out of the region, the specialized predators faced immediate starvation. Homo sapiens, by contrast, treated the entire ecosystem as an interconnected pantry of layered resources. When large game grew scarce, they shifted effortlessly to digging deep underground tubers, cracking mongongo nuts, and harvesting wild grass seeds. They caught freshwater catfish trapped in evaporating oxbow lakes, snared nesting waterfowl, and tracked subterranean honeycombs by reading the flights of birds. This broad-spectrum foraging meant that a human band rarely starved because of a single ecological failure. They simply pivoted down the trophic ladder. Dietary flexibility, however, was impossible without an accompanying revolution in food processing technologies. Many wild roots and tubers were dense with toxic alkaloids or armored in fibrous starches that the human stomach could not naturally digest. Through the deliberate use of fire, early humans broke down these chemical defenses, turning toxic or unpalatable roots into dense packets of bioavailable carbohydrates. They used stone anvils to smash open marrow-filled bones that other scavengers had abandoned, extracting concentrated fats crucial for brain metabolism during times of food scarcity. Cooking was not merely a culinary preference. It was an external digestive system that allowed humans to absorb maximum energy with minimal physical exertion. By mastering fire, our ancestors transformed marginal landscapes into survivable homelands. Nowhere was this ecological opportunism more dramatic than along the southern and eastern coastlines of Africa. At archaeological sites like Pinnacle Point and Blombos Cave along the rugged southern cape, ancient humans discovered an almost inexhaustible reservoir of marine nutrition. When inland droughts scorched the interior savannas, coastal cliffs provided stable access to brown mussels, limpets, marine snails, and stranded sea mammals. Foraging along the intertidal zone required a sophisticated understanding of lunar cycles and tidal fluctuations, since harvesting was safe only during extreme low tides. The brain-boosting omega-3 fatty acids gathered from these rocky shores fueled cognitive development while insulating populations against continental megadroughts. Marine ecosystems operated on entirely different biological clocks than inland ecosystems, acting as a permanent ecological buffer during terrestrial collapses. Coastlines were not barriers to human expansion. They were rich, continuous highways that offered stable sustenance when the interior withered. These African survival systems eventually coalesced into a lifestyle that was inherently dynamic, networked, and mobile. Small foraging bands did not live in permanent isolation, but maintained complex webs of exchange, intermarriage, and ritual visitation across immense distances. Marine shells from the Indian Ocean have been unearthed hundreds of miles inland, and high-quality silcrete stone was transported across rugged mountain chains. These items were not traded for commercial profit, but served as physical tokens of social insurance between distant communities. If a localized drought decimated the resources of one valley, the affected band could invoke kinship ties and find refuge within the territory of their trading partners. Social reciprocity converted empty geography into a vast safety net of shared human resilience. When wet climatic pulses temporarily turned the Sinai Peninsula and the Arabian Desert into lush corridors of rivers and lakes, small populations of Homo sapiens crossed into Eurasia. This was not a single, grand expedition driven by visionary explorers, but a multi-generational drift following the natural movements of game herds. Groups moved outward, paused in fertile valleys, expanded during favorable wet periods, and occasionally retreated or died out when aridity returned. But as human populations pushed further north into the Levant and toward the Anatolian Plateau, they encountered an environmental threshold unlike anything their African ancestors had known. The perpetual warmth of the tropics gave way to severe continental winters, freezing winds, and landscapes blanketed in heavy snow. Deciduous forests gave way to bitter steppes, and the biological clock of the year was dictated by the stark brutality of frost. The warm-weather primate was now forced to confront a world where exposure to the open air could freeze unprotected flesh within minutes. In this unforgiving Eurasian expanse, humans encountered other ancient hominin species who had lived through hundreds of thousands of years of ice and frost. Chief among them were the Neanderthals, stocky, heavily muscled hunters whose biological proportions were perfectly engineered for cold climate heat retention. Neanderthals possessed broad nasal cavities to warm freezing air, compact limbs to reduce surface area, and massive bone density suited for close-quarters hunting of large Pleistocene mammals. They were not brutish, mindless ape men, but sophisticated survivors who wielded complex stone tools, used fire consistently, buried their dead, and produced symbolic pigments. When expanding populations of Homo sapiens met Neanderthals in the river valleys of the Middle East and Europe, their encounters were not solely defined by conflict. They looked across their shared campfires, recognized a common humanity, exchanged ideas, and interbred across thousands of years. The genetic legacy of those ancient encounters remains stamped into the DNA of nearly all non-African human populations today. Neanderthal genetic variants contributed to modern human immune systems, keratin production for thicker skin and hair, and cellular adaptations for cold endurance. Farther east, in the Denisova cave of the Altai Mountains, humans encountered another archaic sister lineage, the Denisovans, exchanging genes that would later aid survival in high-altitude environments. Yet while our biological cousins carried genetic adaptations forged over 500,000 years of cold exposure, Homo sapiens brought an entirely different weapon: cultural hyperplasticity. Neanderthals lived in small, highly localized populations that were vulnerable to regional crashes, rarely maintaining the vast social exchange networks of Homo sapiens. As erratic climate swings battered Europe, Neanderthal populations fragmented and dwindled, their numbers slowly absorbed into the broader sea of modern humans. In the end, biological specialization for cold proved less resilient than cultural adaptability and expansive social networking. To conquer the northern latitudes, Homo sapiens had to construct a portable, artificial microclimate capable of encasing the human body. Simply draping raw animal skins over the shoulders, as earlier hominins had done, was insufficient against sub-zero blizzards that drove wind through every opening. The breakthrough arrived with the development of precision tailoring, enabled by one of the most transformative inventions in human history, the eyebone needle. Carved from the dense leg bones of reindeer or mammoth ivory, these tiny instruments allowed ancient tailors to stitch together multiple layers of cured hide using fine sinew threads. They engineered parkas that trapped pockets of dead air, fitted boots lined with insulating grass, and seamless leather mittens that prevented frostbite. A needle was not merely an implement of domestic craft. It was the ultimate survival apparatus that opened the frozen plains of Siberia to human habitation. Tailored clothing turned the fragile human form into a self-contained thermodynamic unit capable of operating in sub-zero wilderness. Outer garments made of tough, wind-proof bison leather protected inner layers of soft, insulating reindeer fur turned inward against the skin. The hood was carefully trimmed with wolverine or wolf fur, fibers that naturally shed ice and prevented the hunter's breath from freezing into a suffocating crust around the face. Moisture management became an exact science, because sweat inside a garment during a heavy chase could freeze into fatal ice the moment the hunter rested. Children were clothed in meticulously fitted bodysuits, ensuring that the next generation survived the grueling migrations between seasonal hunting grounds. With this second skin, humans achieved in a few generations what other species spent millions of years evolving through biological mutation. The creature born under the blazing equatorial sky had learned how to bring its own tropical environment wherever it walked. Beyond clothing, the deep Eurasian cold demanded revolutionary approaches to human architecture and fire management. Natural limestone caves and rock shelters were invaluable refuges, but they were geographically fixed and often inhabited by formidable predators like cave bears and cave hyenas. Across the treeless, windswept plains of modern-day Ukraine, Russia, and Central Europe, early humans could not rely on timber to frame their shelters. Instead, they turned to the architectural potential of the largest creatures walking the steppe, the woolly mammoth. At sites like Mazyrik, Kostenki, and Dolny Vestines, human bands engineered massive circular dwellings constructed entirely from mammoth bones, tusks, and hides. They interlocked hundreds of mandibles, long bones, and skulls into load-bearing walls designed to deflect the relentless howling of Arctic winds. The roofs of these monumental dwellings were constructed from interlaced mammoth tusks, covered in heavy hides, and banked with earth and turf for deep thermal insulation. Inside, the sunken hearths were fueled not by scarce firewood, but by the fat-rich, spongy interior of cancellous mammoth bone. When ignited over dry kindling, pulverized bone burned with a hot, sustained, and luminous flame that warmed the interior for hours. These mammoth bone houses were more than rudimentary shelters. They were sophisticated, multi-family engineering marvels that functioned as winter villages. Within their insulated walls, people stored cured meat in permafrost cellar pits, manufactured complex composite tools, and tended their children through months of total darkness. The hearth at the center of the structure became the beating heart of social life, turning long, deadly winters into productive seasons of cultural transmission. While blizzards raged outside, inside the bone lodge, humanity preserved its warmth, its stories, and its future. The hearth was also the primary laboratory where ancient humans refined their technologies through careful pyrotechnic experimentation. They discovered that certain silkrete and flint stones, when slowly heated in the embers and buried in sand, changed their crystalline structure. Heat-treated stone flaked with far greater precision, allowing toolmakers to strike razor-sharp blades that were impossibly thin and uniform. Around 29,000 years ago at Dolny Vestines, hunters made an astonishing leap. They mixed lush clay with powdered bone and baked the mixture in specialized kilns. These fired ceramic figurines of animals and human forms represent the earliest known pyrotechnology in the archaeological record, tens of thousands of years before the invention of pottery vessels. Fire was no longer just a source of warmth and light. It was a tool for chemical transformation. Hunting on the Eurasian mammoth steppe was a high-stakes endeavor that required flawless coordination, planning, and collective courage. The landscape was an immense, rolling grassland that stretched from the Atlantic shores of France across Siberia to the Bering Strait. It supported a biomass of large herbivores that rivaled the modern Serengeti: millions of reindeer, wild horses, steppe bison, saiga antelopes, woolly rhinos, and mammoths. Yet confronting a 4-ton bull mammoth armed with 10-foot curving tusks with handheld wooden lances was an invitation to slaughter. To minimize risk, Paleolithic hunters developed projectile technologies that allowed them to strike lethal blows from safe distances. They invented the spear thrower, or otlotl, a hooked lever carved from reindeer antler that mechanically multiplied the speed and kinetic force of a thrown dart. A dart launched with an otlotl could penetrate the thick hide and muscle of a running bison at distances exceeding 50 yards. Hunters also used landscape features as strategic hunting weapons, understanding animal psychology with unmatched intimacy. They constructed funnel-shaped drive lanes using stone cairns and brush, guiding entire herds of reindeer toward narrow river crossings or dead-end ravines. When the animals were trapped in deep water or floundered in seasonal snowbanks, hunters struck in synchronized, cooperative ambushes. A single coordinated hunt could yield tens of thousands of pounds of meat, fat, hides, sinew, and bone in a single afternoon. The meat was immediately stripped, sliced into thin sheets, and dried or smoked over smudge fires to prevent spoilage. In permafrost zones, large butchered quarters were buried in deep frozen pits, creating natural cryogenic freezers that provided food through the leanest months of early spring. Yet the material successes of Ice Age humanity were only half of the equation. Their internal symbolic world was equally vast and vital. Deep in the pitch-black recesses of limestone caverns like Chauvet, Lascaux, Altamira, and Niaus, artists crawled through tight passages to create masterpieces of visual art. By the flickering light of tallow lamps, they blew charcoal dust and red ochre across the contours of natural rock walls. They brought galloping horses, fighting rhinoceroses, stalking cave lions, and soaring bison to life with startling realism and dynamic motion. These subterranean galleries were not casual art galleries or comfortable living spaces, but sacred sanctuaries located hundreds of yards from daylight. The creation of cave art demanded enormous investments of time, resources, and technical mastery, from scaffolding construction to pigment chemistry. Why would people living on the edge of survival expend so much precious energy painting animals on dark cavern walls? Far from being a luxury of idle leisure, symbolic culture was a core component of humanity's survival architecture. The arts served as a sacred archive of ecological memory, encoding the behaviors, seasonal movements, and spiritual significance of the animals upon which human life depended. In the dark chambers, elders initiated the young into the collective cosmology of the tribe, fusing emotional reverence with practical hunting knowledge. The shared rituals inside painted caves bound disparate bands together under a common cultural identity and moral framework. When distant groups gathered for seasonal ceremonies at major cave sites, they renewed alliances, arranged interband marriages, and traded rare materials. Symbolic culture transformed scattered, vulnerable hunter-gatherers into a unified, resilient, and interconnected regional society. This symbolic explosion manifested not only in cave paintings, but in the meticulous decoration of the human body itself. Excavations at Upper Paleolithic burial sites like Sungir in Russia reveal individuals laid to rest in garments adorned with thousands of individually carved mammoth ivory beads. Producing these beads required hundreds of hours of labor, grinding, perforating, and polishing each tiny disc with flint drills and abrasive sand. These beads were not mere vanity. They functioned as visual markers of social status, lineage, tribal affiliation, and reciprocal relationships. An ornament was a badge of identity that communicated who a person was and which network they belonged to long before a word was spoken. When a hunter encountered a stranger on the frozen steppe, the style of beads, the color of ochre, and the shape of weapon points signaled whether the encounter meant trade or danger. In an unstable world where strangers could be life-saving allies or deadly rivals, symbolic communication maintained the peace. That social peace was repeatedly tested by the volatile nature of the Pleistocene climate itself. The popular notion of the Ice Age as a static, unvarying epoch of permanent frost is contradicted by modern paleoclimatology. Ice cores drilled deep into the Greenland ice sheet reveal that the climate swung with violent, erratic speed during what scientists called Dansgaard-Oeschger events. Within the span of a single human generation, regional temperatures could spike by 10 to 15 degrees, melting glaciers and altering rainfall patterns across continents. Decades of sudden warmth were followed by equally rapid plunges back into bone-chilling cold and prolonged aridity. A landscape that was dense pine forest when a child was born could turn into open, frozen grassland by the time that child reached old age. These abrupt climatic reversals prevented human cultures from ever settling into rigid, unchanging traditions. What worked for a grandfather during a warm, wet cycle became useless when his grandson faced an advancing wall of cold steppe. The only tradition that truly mattered was the tradition of adaptability, the willingness to abandon outdated habits the moment the ecology shifted. Communities that survived were those that preserved alternative survival strategies within their oral traditions. They kept alive the knowledge of how to fish even when hunting bison was good, and they remembered where wild roots grew even when reindeer were plentiful. Collective memory acted as a cultural repository of dormant skills waiting to be reactivated when environmental catastrophe struck. The past was never dead. It was an instruction manual for the next inevitable crisis. Around 74,000 years ago, this human capacity for resilience faced one of its most severe tests in deep prehistory. On the island of Sumatra, in modern-day Indonesia, the supervolcano Toba exploded in a cataclysm of unimaginable magnitude. It was one of the largest explosive volcanic events on Earth in the last 2 million years, ejecting thousands of cubic kilometers of rock, ash, and pyroclastic debris. A colossal cloud of pulverized silicate dust rose tens of miles into the stratosphere, spreading east and west across the globe. In India and Southeast Asia, volcanic ash blankets accumulated several feet thick, choking river systems, crushing vegetation, and suffocating wildlife. Stratospheric sulfur aerosols formed a reflective veil that bounced solar radiation back into space, triggering a multi-year global temperature drop. For years, scientists debated whether the Toba eruption plunged the planet into a severe volcanic winter that decimated early Homo sapiens down to a few thousand breeding pairs. While early bottleneck theories painted a picture of near-total extinction, more recent archaeological and environmental findings present a much more nuanced reality. In southern India, at sites like Jwalapuram, archaeologists have uncovered stone tool assemblages lying directly beneath and immediately above the thick Toba ash layer. The tools show remarkable technological continuity, proving that human populations not only survived the ash fall, but continued living in the affected river valleys. In southern Africa, sediment cores from Lake Malawi show that the local ecology remains surprisingly resilient despite the atmospheric disturbance. The impact of Toba was not a uniform, global apocalypse, but an uneven ecological shock that varied drastically across different regions and biomes. Where some local environments collapsed into darkness and drought, others retained sufficient moisture and game to sustain flexible human groups. The Toba event demonstrated that humanity's ultimate defense against global catastrophe was the decentralized, scattered nature of our populations. We were not concentrated in a single fragile biome, but distributed across river valleys, tropical coasts, savannas, and mountain fringes. If an environmental shock wiped out hunting herds in one quadrant, coastal populations miles away continued harvesting shellfish undisturbed by the ash veil. Hunter-gatherers in South Asia adapted by utilizing localized refugia, focusing on riverine fish, burrowing reptiles, and subsurface roots that survive the dust. Their small group sizes, high mobility, and low per capita resource demands allowed them to squeeze through ecological bottlenecks that doomed larger, specialized animals. Humanity survived the volcanic winter not because we conquered the sky, but because we knew how to live on the margins of a broken world. As the atmospheric ash slowly settled and the planetary climate stabilized, the relentless rhythm of the Pleistocene continued its march. Human populations rebounded, expanded, and developed ever more specialized toolkits across Africa, Europe, Asia, and Australasia. By 40,000 years ago, modern humans had crossed open ocean channels to settle Australia, navigating deep water using sophisticated rafts and celestial tracking. In the northern hemisphere, the climate was grinding toward the coldest, driest, and most extreme phase of the entire Ice Age cycle. Between 26,000 and 19,000 years ago, the planet entered the last glacial maximum. Enormous continental ice sheets, several miles thick in places, swallowed vast swathes of North America, northern Europe, and western Siberia. The northern world was squeezed into a brutal vise of ice, wind, and aridity, forcing all living things into a desperate retreat toward survival havens. As trillions of tons of atmospheric moisture froze onto the continents, global sea levels plummeted by more than 400 feet. Shallow ocean shelves emerged from the waves, transforming the geography of the planet into a configuration unrecognizable to modern eyes. Across the globe, vast continental plains opened between land masses that had previously been separated by deep water. What is now the floor of the North Sea was a sprawling, rich expanse of marsh, river, and woodland known as Doggerland. Between Siberia and Alaska, a 1,000-mile-wide plain of cold steppe emerged from the retreating Pacific, the great land of Beringia. In Southeast Asia, the shallow sea floor dried to form Sundaland, uniting the islands of Sumatra, Java, and Borneo into a massive tropical peninsula. For the human communities living through the last glacial maximum, these newly exposed coastal plains were not barren frontiers, but rich, dynamic heartlands. Doggerland became one of the most productive foraging landscapes in prehistoric Europe, crisscrossed by the ancestral Thames, Rhine, and Seine rivers. Massive herds of horses, red deer, and mammoths migrated across its lush alluvial valleys, tracked by generations of human hunting bands. Archaeological trawlers in the North Sea regularly dredge up bone points, barbed harpoons, and worked ivory from the submerged riverbeds of this lost world. In Beringia, human groups developed specialized subarctic survival strategies, hunting steppe bison and waterfowl while sheltered in low willow-lined river bottoms. Beringia was not a frozen bridge to be crossed in haste, but a homeland where populations lived, adapted, and diversified for thousands of years. These drowned continents remind us that human history was written on landscapes that nature would later erase beneath the rising sea. When the great planetary thaw finally began around 19,000 years ago, it did not bring a gentle, peaceful return to warmth. It triggered an epoch of catastrophic environmental instability, glacial collapse, and relentless sea level rise. As the continental ice sheets melted, trillions of gallons of freshwater poured into the world's oceans, lifting coastlines by inches every year. Ancient shorelines were swallowed, forcing coastal communities to continuously dismantle their camps and retreat inland before the advancing surf. Dwellings where grandparents had gathered around the fire were submerged beneath saltwater bays and brackish estuaries. The very landscapes that had provided salvation during the height of the Ice Age were systematically drowned by the rising tide of planetary change. The drowning of Doggerland unfolded across millennia, culminating in a series of dramatic marine incursions that turned high hills into isolated islands. Around 8,200 years ago, a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, known as the Storegga Slide, triggered a towering tsunami. A wall of seawater swept across the remaining low-lying marshes of Doggerland, wiping out coastal settlements and permanently severing Britain from the European continent. In the Pacific, the rising waves drowned the plains of Beringia, cutting off the overland corridor and creating the modern Bering Strait. The human response to this epic loss was not despair, but another masterclass in behavioral flexibility and technological innovation. Foragers took to the water, carving seaworthy dugout canoes, crafting sophisticated fish weirs, and mastering coastal navigation. Where their ancestors had tracked mammoths across dry steppe, the new generations speared salmon, harpooned seals, and navigated archipelagos. Through the fire of the African droughts, the bitter cold of the Eurasian ice sheets, the darkness of volcanic dust, and the drowning of their homelands, our ancestors never stopped adapting. They survived because they understood that human survival was not a static destination, but an ongoing process of observation, memory, and reinvention. They carried their world not in the weight of heavy stone monuments, but in the lightness of portable tools, tailored clothes, and spoken stories. Every challenge thrown down by an unstable planet was met with a cultural response that rewrote the rules of biological possibility. We are the descendants of those who looked at vanishing lakes, advancing glaciers, and rising seas, and chose to walk forward into the unknown. Their resilience is woven into the very fabric of our biology, our language, and our enduring ability to survive a changing world. Just as the Earth appeared to be settling into a stable, sunlit thaw, the sky betrayed humanity once again with staggering violence. Around 12,900 years ago, when the great glaciers were in full retreat and meltwater was carving emerald valleys across Europe and the Americas, global temperatures suddenly plummeted off a climatic cliff. Enormous glacial reservoirs of trapped freshwater, such as the colossal Lake Agassiz in central North America, suffered catastrophic collapses of their ice dams, dumping millions of cubic miles of frigid meltwater directly into the North Atlantic. This tremendous influx of fresh water diluted the salinity of the ocean, effectively shutting down the conveyor belt of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. Within less than a human generation, the warm maritime winds died, and Arctic cold roared back across the northern hemisphere. This brutal climatic reversal, known to modern science as the Younger Dryas, lasted for over 1,200 years of bitter drought and freezing temperatures. For the human hunting bands who had spent centuries learning the habits of a warming world, this sudden return of the frost was an ecological catastrophe. Across North America, the famous Clovis culture, renowned for its finely flaked, fluted stone spearheads, suddenly vanished from the archaeological record. The forests dried into brittle tinder, forest fires of apocalyptic scale swept across continents, and the seasonal migrations of animals became wildly unpredictable. At the very same moment, the magnificent giants of the Pleistocene world began to disappear forever from the surface of the earth. Mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, giant ground sloths, and the ancient camels of the American plains all marched into extinction. Whether finished off by rapid climatic shock, the total restructuring of plant ecosystems, human overhunting, or a fatal combination of all three, the megafauna were gone. The loss of these massive animals stripped Paleolithic hunters of their most abundant source of concentrated protein, fat, bone, and insulating hides. Humanity could no longer rely on bringing down a single colossal herbivore to sustain an entire band through the lean weeks of early spring. In response, human toolkits underwent a radical and immediate transformation toward precision, miniaturization, and broad-spectrum foraging. In North America, the successors of Clovis developed smaller, razor-sharp fulsome points, shifting their focus to hunting the faster, smaller bison antiquus in tightly orchestrated surround hunts. In Europe and Asia, the great open mammoth steppes shrank and were replaced by dense, shadowy temperate forests of birch, pine, and oak. Hunters who had spent generations throwing darts with spear throwers across treeless horizons were now forced to hunt solitary red deer, roe deer, and wild boars through thick, tangled undergrowth. To master these new, cluttered forest environments, human beings invented the bow and arrow, a technology of unprecedented mechanical elegance and stealth. Arrows could be launched through narrow gaps in the tree canopy without requiring the wide, athletic motion needed to throw an otlotl dart. Woodworkers crafted light, flexible arrow shafts tipped with geometric microliths, tiny, razor-sharp flint blades set in rows along wooden and bone points using birch bark pitch. These composite weapons allowed hunters to carry dozens of lightweight projectiles, ensuring that a missed shot did not leave a tracker defenseless in the deep woods. Along the coasts, rivers, and newly formed post-glacial lakes, communities constructed complex fish weirs out of woven hazel branches, speared salmon with barbed bone harpoons, and mastered the art of carving buoyant dugout canoes from massive fallen pine trunks. The era of the mammoth hunter was over, but the era of the resourceful forest and river forager had begun. While the northern hemisphere shuddered under the frost of the Younger Dryas, the tropics were preparing for an equally monumental transformation that would turn the driest wasteland on Earth into a paradise. Due to slow, predictable shifts in the tilt and precession of the Earth's axis, the northern hemisphere began receiving significantly more solar radiation during its summer months. This intense solar heating warmed the African landmass far more quickly than the surrounding oceans, creating a massive low-pressure system that drew in deep, moisture-laden monsoon winds from the Atlantic. Beginning roughly 11,000 years ago, this climatic engine initiated the African humid period, known popularly as the Green Sahara. Over the course of a few centuries, the scorching yellow dunes of the world's largest desert transformed into a rolling expanse of savannas, grasslands, gallery forests, and immense freshwater lake systems. The prehistoric Sahara became an aquatic wonderland dominated by Lake Mega-Chad, an inland sea that expanded to cover more than 130,000 square miles, dwarfing all modern Great Lakes combined. Giant rivers, like the ancient Tamanrasset, flowed for thousands of miles across what is now barren, wind-swept sand, connecting the interior of the continent to the Atlantic Ocean. Hippopotamuses, crocodiles, elephants, giraffes, and massive schools of Nile perch colonized this green wilderness, followed closely by waves of human foragers. At sites like Gabbero in modern-day Niger, archaeologists have unearthed human skeletons buried with delicate ivory ornaments, resting beside the fossilized bones of giant catfish and turtles. These Saharan hunter-gatherers developed some of the earliest ceramic vessels in human history, using decorated pottery pots to boil and store aquatic plants, fish stews, and wild grass seeds thousands of years before the arrival of agriculture. Across the dramatic sandstone plateaus of the Central Sahara, at places like Tassili Niger and the Eneti Mountains, ancient artists painted and engraved thousands of vivid scenes upon open rock faces. Their vibrant frescoes depict swimmers diving into deep river pools, hunters stalking antelopes with bows, and herders guiding massive herds of long-horned cattle across emerald pastures. These paintings capture an ancient reality so utterly divorced from the modern desert that it feels like mythology, yet the bones, pollens, and lake sediments prove every brushstroke was real. For nearly 5,000 years, generations of pastoralists lived across the lush Saharan heartland, moving their cattle with the seasonal rains and developing deep cosmological connections to the animals they herded. They lived in an environment of extraordinary abundance, unaware that the astronomical clock overhead was quietly winding down and that the monsoon rains would not last forever. While the green Sahara bloomed, another profound transformation was quietly unfolding thousands of miles to the northeast, along the rocky hills and valleys of the Levant. In this region, encompassing modern-day Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, a distinctive culture known as the Natufians had begun to alter humanity's relationship with the land. Blessed with natural oak, pistachio woodlands, and vast, spontaneous stands of wild emmer wheat and wild barley, the Natufians realized they no longer needed to maintain a fully nomadic lifestyle. They established the world's first semi-permanent villages, building circular stone-founded houses partially dug into the earth to retain warmth in winter and coolness in summer. Inside these subterranean homes, families slept around central stone-lined hearths, grinding wild grains into coarse flour using heavy basalt mortars and pestles that weighed over 100 pounds. The Natufians harvested wild grasses using curved wooden and bone sickles inset, with shimmering flint bladelets that developed a distinctive glossy polish from the silica in plant stalks. To preserve their harvests against rot and rodents, they dug plaster-lined storage pits deep into the earth, creating the first true granaries in human history. With stored food came the luxury of settled life, but also an unprecedented vulnerability. Once a population commits to living off stored grain in a fixed village, they can no longer easily flee when environmental crisis strikes. When the dry, freezing cold of the younger Dryas struck the Levant, wild cereal stands shrank and retreated to the highest, wettest mountain slopes. Faced with the choice between abandoning their ancestral stone villages to return to full nomadism or finding a way to increase the yield of the land, the descendants of the Natufians made an epoch-defining choice. They began clearing weeds, diverting small streams to irrigate patches of wild grass, and deliberately saving the largest seeds to plant in freshly turned soil. This was not a sudden stroke of individual genius, but a slow, agonizing process of co-evolution between humans and plants that spanned dozens of generations. In the wild, cereal grasses are engineered by nature to disperse their seeds easily. As soon as the grain ripens, the brittle central stem, or rachis, shatters, scattering the seeds across the ground where animals cannot easily devour them all. When humans began harvesting wild stands with sickles, however, they preferentially harvested the rare mutant plants whose rachis was tough and did not shatter, carrying those unbroken seed heads back to the village. When these non-shattering seeds were replanted the following season, humans unconsciously selected for plants that completely surrendered their ability to reproduce without human intervention. Wild emmer, einkorn, barley, lentils, peas, chickpeas, and flax were systematically transformed from wild flora into fully domesticated crops. Humans had ceased to merely gather what the earth provided. we had begun rewriting the genetic architecture of the living world. Yet before domesticated crops had fully replaced wild foraging, ancient communities in southeastern Anatolia achieved something that overturned every traditional assumption of modern archaeology. At sites like Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe in the limestone hills of modern-day Turkey, hunter-gatherers who possessed neither domesticated crops nor draft animals erected monumental stone temple complexes. Beginning over 11,000 years ago, hundreds of people gathered on high limestone ridges to quarry, carve, and transport monolithic T-shaped pillars weighing up to 20 tons each. These colossal stones were arranged in massive concentric circles, supported by dry stone walls, and paved with smooth, polished terrazzo floors. Into the hard limestone surfaces of these pillars, master sculptors carved high-relief figures of ferocious predators, snarling lions, striking vipers, predatory foxes, scorpions, wild boars, and vultures hovering over headless human bodies. The construction of Göbekli Tepe was an astonishing logistical and social achievement that required the coordinated labor of hundreds of individuals from disparate, wandering bands. To feed the massive workforce needed to quarry and haul these multi-ton monoliths across rocky plateaus, the organizers had to amass unprecedented reserves of food and drink. Archaeologists have discovered massive stone vats capable of holding hundreds of gallons of liquid, suggesting that large-scale brewing of wild grain beer played a central role in attracting and motivating laborers. Immense bone beds nearby reveal that the builders slaughtered thousands of wild gazelles, aurochs, and wild sheep to fuel the monumental stone-lifting feasts. It was not agriculture that generated the surplus required to build religion and monumental architecture, but rather the religious urge to gather and build monuments that forced humanity to invent agriculture. The sacred preceded the profane. Humanity learned to farm because it needed to feed the gods. Once the threshold of domestication was crossed, the Neolithic Revolution spread across the Fertile Crescent like wildfire, fundamentally reorganizing human biology, society, and domestic life. Along with crops, humans domesticated the wild animals that had once been hunted across the foothills. Wild mouflon sheep became woolly domestic sheep. The fierce wild Bezoar ibex was tamed into the domestic goat, and the massive, dangerous aurochs was gradually bred down into docile cattle. These animals became walking storehouses of fat, protein, manure, and muscle, providing reliable milk, cheese, leather, and wool through all seasons. Yet this newfound agricultural security came with a dark, unforeseen biological tax that was immediately inscribed upon the human skeleton. Hunter-gatherers had enjoyed diverse, nutrient-rich diets and varied daily physical routines that left their bones robust, tall, and largely free of degenerative diseases. Neolithic farmers, by contrast, sacrificed their physical health on the altar of caloric predictability. Skeletons from early agricultural sites show a dramatic decline in average human height, pervasive iron deficiency anemia, and teeth riddled with painful dental caries caused by high-carbohydrate cereal diets. The relentless, grueling labor of clearing fields, digging irrigation ditches, and kneeling for hours to grind grain on stone querns deformed the spines, knees, and toes of early farming women. Living in close, permanent proximity to domesticated animals exposed human populations to a terrifying new pantheon of zoonotic pathogens that jumped the species barrier. Measles, smallpox, influenza, tuberculosis, and malaria all originated in the dung-covered corrals and stagnant drainage channels of early farming settlements. Agriculture was not an easy, idyllic paradise. It was a grueling biological pact that traded individual health for raw demographic expansion. As populations multiplied exponentially on their grain surpluses, the first true proto-cities began rising across the landscape of the ancient Near East. At Jericho, nestled in the fertile oasis of the Jordan Rift Valley, early farmers constructed a massive, circular stone defense tower and surrounded their settlement with an 8-foot-thick stone wall cut directly into the bedrock. At Catalhoyuk, spread across the alluvial plain of central Anatolia, over 8,000 people lived in a dense, honeycombed mega-settlement made entirely of sun-dried mud brick. The city possessed no streets, alleys, or public plazas. Instead, Houses were packed tightly against one another like a massive honeycomb, and daily life was conducted entirely across the flat rooftops. Residents entered their homes by descending wooden ladders through smoke holes in the ceiling, living in pristine, white-plastered rooms adorned with carved bull skulls, wall paintings of erupting volcanoes, and intricate plaster reliefs of leopards. Beneath the clay floors of these cattle-hoyuk houses, families buried the skeletal remains of their deceased ancestors, maintaining a continuous physical and spiritual connection between the living and the dead. In some households, the skulls of respected elders were exhumed after decomposition, carefully coated in fine white plaster, and artistically remodeled with painted features and cowrie shells pressed into the eye sockets to recreate living human faces. These plastered skulls were kept in family shrines, held during ancestral rituals, and passed down through generations as tangible anchors of family lineage and land rights. As communities became sedentary, the concept of land ownership, inheritance, and tribal territory became matters of absolute survival. The soil had been cleared, irrigated, and fertilized with human blood and sweat. It was no longer just an open landscape, but private, ancestral property. Yet even this advanced, sedentary world of early farmers remained completely at the mercy of sudden planetary climate shifts. Around 8,200 years ago, the global climate was struck by another sharp, worldwide shock known as the 8.2 kiloyear event. The final, catastrophic collapse of the remnants of the Laurentide ice sheet in North America unleashed another titanic burst of subglacial meltwater into the Atlantic Ocean, triggering 2 to 3 centuries of severe global cooling and extreme continental drying. Across the Near East and Mediterranean, rainfall dropped by up to 40%, causing long-standing rivers to dry into dusty channels and agricultural yields to collapse. Massive, long-occupied settlements like Cattle-Hogue fractured and were abandoned, as populations dispersed into smaller, more mobile pastoral bands searching for water. This crisis forced a profound reorganization of farming societies, weeding out fragile, oversized proto-cities and accelerating the migration of agriculturalists into Europe, the Mediterranean islands, and the great river valleys of Mesopotamia. While agriculturalists were adapting to erratic rainfall in the Near East, a slow-motion catastrophe was finalizing the destruction of the Green Sahara. As Earth's orbital tilt continued its steady, inevitable cycle, the summer solar radiation over the northern hemisphere weakened, and the life-giving African monsoon began its permanent retreat southward. Beginning around 6,000 years ago, the process of desertification accelerated with devastating speed. The colossal Lake Mega-Chad shrank rapidly, leaving behind vast, salt-encrusted white basins where hippos and crocodiles had once swum. The lush grasslands turned to yellow scrub, the gallery forests withered, and towering sand dunes rolled inexorably southward, burying ancient villages, waterways, and cattle pastures beneath hundreds of feet of sand. For the pastoralist and hunter-fisher communities scattered across the vast Saharan interior, this desertification was an inescapable environmental vice closing from every direction. As waterholes evaporated and grazing pastures vanished under dust storms, millions of humans and their cattle herds were forced to make a desperate choice: migrate south into the tropical forests or flee eastward toward the only permanent, living water source remaining on the northeastern quadrant of the continent. That lifeline was the Nile River, a vast ribbon of freshwater fed by the deep monsoon rains of the Ethiopian highlands and the equatorial lakes of Central Africa. Across centuries of relentless desiccation, diverse Saharan tribes, Mediterranean foragers, and indigenous Nilotic river folk were squeezed together into the narrow, claustrophobic corridor of the Nile floodplain. This environmental compression forced one of the most intense cultural crucibles in human prehistory. Thousands of displaced people, carrying distinct linguistic traditions, cattle-herding rituals, stone technologies, and spiritual mythologies, found themselves packed along the banks of a river that was both a life-giver and a deadly hazard. The Nile was not an open, gentle plain. It was a dense, impenetrable jungle of papyrus marshes, crocodile-infested channels, and seasonal flood zones that demanded radical collective engineering to be made habitable. The old, Egalitarian pastoralist lifestyle was impossible in this crowded, hyper-concentrated environment. To survive, people had to organize labor on a scale never before imagined, draining malarial swamps, cutting massive drainage canals, and building earthen dikes to trap the annual silt-laden floodwaters across their agricultural fields. Managing this complex system of basin irrigation required absolute social discipline, meticulous mathematical surveying, and centralized political authority. If an upstream village failed to maintain its dikes or hoarded water during a low flood year, downstream villages faced catastrophic crop failure and immediate starvation. To prevent chronic civil war and maintain agricultural order, leadership became institutionalized, transforming temporary war chiefs and ritual rainmakers into absolute, divinely sanctioned rulers. Scribes developed the first systems of hieroglyphic writing and numerical notation to measure the exact rise of the annual inundation with nilometers, track grain storage in royal warehouses, and redistribute land boundaries after the floodwaters receded. Out of the desperate environmental flight from the drying Sahara, the unified, hydraulic superstate of pharaonic Egypt was born. A parallel drama was unfolding simultaneously across the dry alluvial plains of southern Mesopotamia, between the wild, unpredictable waters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Unlike the Nile, which flooded predictably in late summer at the perfect moment for autumn planting, the Mesopotamian rivers flooded violently in the spring, threatening to wash away crops right before the harvest. The region possessed almost no natural resources, no building stone, no metal ores, and no harvestable timber, only an infinite ocean of rich river mud and choking reed marshes. Yet through the construction of immense, interconnected canal networks, the ancient Sumerians transformed this inhospitable swamp into the most agriculturally productive landscape on Earth. Out of the mud, they baked millions of sun-dried bricks, constructing the towering, monumental ziggurats and defensive walls of the world's first true metropolis, Uruk. Within the walls of Uruk, over 50,000 people lived in a hyper-stratified, specialized urban ecosystem governed by temple priests, military kings, and a sprawling bureaucracy of scribes. To track the staggering flow of barley, sheep, textiles, and beer through the storehouses of the goddess Inanna, scribes pressed wedge-shaped reed styluses into soft clay tablets, inventing cuneiform writing. Society fractured into rigid classes of nobles, priests, merchants, artisans, agricultural serfs, and enslaved prisoners of war. The freedom and egalitarian balance of the ancient hunting band were completely surrendered to the iron machinery of the urban state. Humanity had successfully insulated itself against the raw instability of the wild sky, but the price of that victory was the creation of permanent social hierarchy, organized warfare, and systemic human labor exploitation. Looking back across the vast expanse of deep prehistory, a profound, undeniable truth emerges about the human condition. We did not build civilizations because we were inherently destined to do so, nor because life in a city was inherently easier or more joyous than life in a foraging band. We invented clothing because the Eurasian glaciers threatened to freeze our tropical flesh. We developed complex social networks because local environmental collapse was an ever-present reality. We domesticated plants and animals because global climatic shifts destroyed the megafauna and shrank wild grasslands. And we built our first great river valley empires because advancing deserts forced thousands of desperate refugees into narrow, water-rich corridors. Every monumental leap in human culture, technology, and social organization was an answer to an environmental crisis that pushed our species to the precipice of extinction. Our ancestors were not the lords of nature, but its most brilliant, desperate, and inventive students. When the skies withheld rain for generations, when the glaciers locked up the world's waters, when supervolcanoes dimmed the sun, and when rising oceans swallowed ancient homelands beneath the waves, humans did not surrender to despair. They gathered around the embers of their hearths, listened to the wisdom of their elders, reimagined their tools, restructured their societies, and walked with quiet courage into the unknown. The blood of those resilient Pleistocene survivors runs through our veins today, carrying the hard-won memory of 1,000 environmental triumphs. As we face the emerging uncertainties of our own changing world, their ancient, unrecorded journey stands as an eternal testament to what human beings can achieve when they choose to remember, cooperate, and adapt beneath an indifferent sky. As the great river valleys of the ancient world filled with mud brick monuments and irrigated fields, humanity succumbed to a dangerous illusion. Having tamed the annual floods of the Nile and channeled the wild currents of the Tigris and Euphrates, the rulers of the early Bronze Age began to believe they had conquered the wild caprices of the natural world. Cities grew larger, trade routes stretched across thousands of leagues of desert and sea, and specialized bureaucracies recorded every bushel of grain with mathematical arrogance. Kings declared themselves the earthly representatives of the gods, building stone tombs that scraped the sky to broadcast their eternal dominion over time and nature. Yet beneath the veneer of imperial permanence, these complex urban networks were far more fragile than the nomadic bands that had walked the Pleistocene steppe. By tethering their survival to vast, rigid irrigation grids and hyper-specialized international trade routes, early civilizations had built an intricate machine that a single environmental shock could smash to pieces. Nowhere was this delicate balance between environmental engineering and urban sophistication more brilliantly realized than in the vast river basin of the Indus Valley. Spanning hundreds of thousands of square miles across modern-day Pakistan and northwestern India, the Harappan civilization arose around 5,300 years ago as an urban marvel of unmatched scale and egalitarian organization. Unlike the war-torn city-states of Mesopotamia or the monument-obsessed dynasties of Egypt, the great cities of Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, and Dhalavira were built without royal palaces, colossal temples, or glorifications of military conquerors. Instead, Harappan engineers directed their monumental labor toward public sanitation, clean water access, and urban planning of staggering precision. Every house was constructed from standardized baked bricks with exact 4:1 dimensions, featuring private bathrooms, internal wells, and covered terracotta drainage pipes that emptied into central subterranean sewers beneath broad, grid-patterned avenues. At the fortress city of Dhalavira, situated on the arid island of Kadir Bet in the Great Rann of Kutch, ancient engineers mastered the art of extreme water harvesting in a landscape where rain was scarce and unpredictable. The entire perimeter of the city was fortified by a chain of 16 colossal stone-cut reservoirs capable of storing over 250,000 cubic meters of seasonal runoff. Massive storm drains carved directly into the bedrock captured the flash floods of two seasonal streams, channeling the precious torrents through complex settling tanks that filtered out silt before storing the clean water inside the citadel. Harappan merchants used this hydraulic security to build a thriving maritime empire, sailing deep-hulled wooden vessels across the Arabian Sea to trade carnelian beads, lapis lazuli, timber, and cotton textiles with the ports of Sumer. For nearly a millennium, the Indus cities flourished because they were perfectly harmonized with the rhythm of the seasonal summer monsoons. Yet this magnificent urban civilization was entirely dependent on a delicate hydroclimatic engine that was slowly winding down in the upper atmosphere. Around 4,000 years ago, the southward migration of the intertropical convergence zone caused the Indian summer monsoon to weaken steadily, reducing the rainfall that fed the massive Himalayan river systems. The sacred Sarasvati River, identified by geologists as the ancient Ghaggar-Hakra system that sustained hundreds of Harappan settlements, began to lose its perennial flow and dry into seasonal ponds. As the summer rains failed, the heavy silt deposits that revitalized the agricultural floodplains vanished, and the fields could no longer produce the massive grain surpluses required to feed tens of thousands of urban dwellers. The Harappans did not perish in a dramatic cataclysm of fire or foreign invasion. Instead, their civilization underwent a slow, graceful, and decentralized urbanization. Families gradually packed their belongings, abandoned their brick mansions, and migrated eastward toward the moist, rain-fed plains of the Ganges Basin and the foothills of the Himalayas. The great municipal drainage systems filled with blown sand, the standardized weights and measures fell out of use, and the undeciphered Harappan script vanished from daily life. Yet the people survived because they abandoned the rigid, oversized urban machine in favor of flexible, small-scale farming villages cultivating summer-resilient crops like millet and rice. The death of the Harappan cities was not an absolute extinction of a people, but a tactical retreat from an unsustainable urban geometry. When the sky refused to water their imperial gardens, the descendants of the Indus chose survival over stone, carrying their cultural memories into the rural foundations of classical Indian civilization. Simultaneously, on the other side of the Asian continent, another monumental struggle between human engineering and hydrological fury was forging the foundations of Chinese civilization along the Yellow River. Known as China's Sorrow, the Yellow River was both a divine creator of fertile farmland and a terrifying agent of periodic mass destruction. The river flowed through the vast Lush Plateau, cutting through mountains of fine, yellow, wind-blown silt deposited during the Ice Age, and carrying the heaviest sediment load of any river system on Earth. As the river reached the flat alluvial plains of northern China, this massive volume of silt settled onto the riverbed, naturally elevating the bottom of the river above the level of the surrounding landscape. To prevent catastrophic inundations, early Chinese communities constructed towering earthen levees along the riverbanks, inadvertently trapping the roaring torrent in an artificial elevated channel. When exceptional monsoon rains or massive ice jams in the upper reaches breached these levees, the Yellow River would violently change its course in an avulsion of apocalyptic proportions, drowning thousands of square miles and shifting its mouth by hundreds of miles across the map. Around 4,000 years ago, geological evidence from the Glacier Gorge reveals that a colossal earthquake-triggered landslide dammed the upper Yellow River, creating an enormous temporary lake that eventually burst through the debris in a catastrophic outburst flood. This real, geological deluge aligns uncannily with the foundational Chinese cultural myth of the Great Flood and the legendary hero Yu the Great. Unlike earlier rulers who attempted to stop the waters with brute force dams, you earn the mandate of heaven by dredging new channels to guide the floodwaters safely to the sea. The sheer organizational discipline required to manage the Yellow River's seasonal fury catalyzed the birth of China's earliest dynasties, the Erlitou culture and the Shang dynasty, proving once again that complex administrative states are often born as defensive responses to water crises. While the North struggled against the silty violence of the Yellow River using drought-hardy foxtail and broomcorn millet, the lush river basin of the Yangtze River to the south was pioneering an entirely different hydraulic civilization centered on wet rice cultivation. At the ancient city of Liangzhu, dating back more than 5,000 years in the Yangtze Delta, a sophisticated Neolithic culture constructed the oldest known mega-hydraulic dam system in the world. Over 3,000 workers labored for decades to move hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of earth, erecting a complex network of high and low dams, reservoirs, and spillways that controlled seasonal mountain floods across hundreds of square miles. This monumental water control system irrigated thousands of acres of lush rice paddies, feeding a deeply stratified society famed for its exquisite, ritualistic jade carvings of tsong and bai discs. Yet even the advanced hydraulic engineering of Liangzhu was no match for the erratic planetary shifts of the mid-Holocene. Around 4,300 years ago, a series of catastrophic megafloods triggered by anomalous, supercharged monsoon cycles overwhelmed the massive earthen dams, submerging the paved streets and jade workshops beneath thick layers of yellow clay. Silt core analysis reveals that marine inundations and freshwater floods simultaneously contaminated the delicate rice fields with salt and mud, destroying the agricultural engine of the state within a few seasons. The entire Liangzhu culture collapsed abruptly, its jade carving elite vanished, and its survivors scattered into the surrounding hills to adopt less centralized methods of survival. The ruins of Liangzhu remained buried under wetland silt for millennia, a silent testament to the ultimate supremacy of hydrological forces over human architectural ambition. This period of environmental chaos was not localized to China and India. It was part of a global climatic disaster known to modern science as the 4.2 kiloyear event. Beginning around 2,200 years before the Common Era, a sudden, worldwide cooling of the North Atlantic Ocean caused a profound disruption of global atmospheric circulation. The tropical rain belts shifted rapidly, weakening the African, Indian, and Asian monsoons and plunging the entire subtropical band of the Old World into over a century of devastating, multi-decadal drought. From the Mediterranean basin to the Tibetan plateau, temperatures plummeted, rainfall evaporated, and agricultural production suffered widespread, catastrophic failures. Civilizations that had stood for centuries as unshakable monuments of imperial power suddenly found themselves hollowed out by starvation, internal rebellion, and systemic economic collapse. In Egypt, the 4.2 kilo-year event brought a catastrophic end to the Old Kingdom, the golden age of the Great Pyramid builders. The life-giving summer floods of the Nile, fueled by monsoon rains over the Ethiopian highlands, repeatedly failed to arrive, leaving the great river as a muddy, sluggish stream that could not inundate the agricultural basins. Tomb inscriptions from provincial governors of the First Intermediate Period, such as the famous autobiography of Anktifi of Imoala, paint a chilling picture of an entire civilization unraveling into chaos. Anktifi wrote of entire provinces dying of hunger, of people eating their own children out of desperation, and of the central government at Memphis collapsing completely as starving mobs looted the royal granaries. The divine pharaoh, whose supernatural authority rested on his guaranteed ability to command the Nile inundation, was stripped of his mystical legitimacy when the river ran dry. The unified Egyptian state fractured into decades of brutal civil war among warlords fighting for control of the remaining wet pockets of the Nile floodplain. Simultaneously, across the fertile plains of northern Mesopotamia, the 4.2 kilo-year event struck a death blow to the world's first multinational empire, the Akkadian Empire founded by Sargon the Great. At major imperial agricultural hubs like Tel Leilon in the Khabur River Valley of modern-day Syria, archaeological excavations reveal that a thick layer of wind-blown dust suddenly smothered the prosperous urban neighborhoods. The winter rains that watered the rain-fed wheat and barley fields ceased for nearly 3 continuous centuries, turning the breadbasket of the empire into an unlivable, dust-choked desert. Thousands of starving northern farmers fled south toward the irrigated plains of Sumer, swamping the resources of ancient cities like Uruk, and Nippur. To keep these desperate, starving climate refugees from entering the southern river valleys, the Akkadian king Shu-Sin ordered the construction of a massive, 70-mile-long stone and brick defensive wall known as the Repeller of the Amorites. But military walls cannot stop environmental collapse. The influx of displaced populations, combined with declining crop yields and internal revolts, shattered the administrative fabric of the empire. The centralized Akkadian state dissolved into anarchy. Its cities were burned or abandoned, and power decentralized back into competing regional enclaves. The fall of the Akkadian Empire demonstrated a fundamental truth of civilizational collapse. When the ecological foundation of an empire withers, its military fortifications become completely useless against the desperate momentum of hungry human beings. While continental empires withered under drought, a vibrant, seafaring maritime civilization was flourishing on the rugged islands and coasts of the Aegean Sea. On the island of Crete, the Minoans built an opulent, peaceful, and technologically stunning Bronze Age culture centered around sprawling, unfortified palatial complexes like Knossos, Phaistos, and Malea. Minoan palaces were masterpieces of hydraulic engineering, featuring multi-story light wells, terracotta acoustic pipes, sophisticated flush toilets, and complex drainage channels that kept the living quarters cool, clean, and dry. The walls of Knossos were decorated with vibrant, joyful frescoes of athletic youths leaping over charging bulls, elegant women wearing layered flounce skirts, and playful dolphins swimming across azure seas. Minoan merchants dominated the shipping lanes of the eastern Mediterranean, establishing a thalassocracy, or maritime empire, that traded olive oil, wine, decorated ceramics, and saffron for metals and raw materials from Egypt, Cyprus, and the Levant. Yet this radiant island world sat directly atop one of the most violent geological fault lines on Earth, the Hellenic subduction zone. Around 1600 years before the Common Era, the volcanic island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, erupted in a cataclysmic ultra-Plinian explosion that was several times more powerful than the historic eruption of Krakatoa. The volcano blasted its central caldera into the sea, launching a column of pumice, pulverized rock, and sulfurous gases over 20 miles into the stratosphere. Giant pyroclastic flows swept across the island, burying the prosperous Minoan port city of Akrotiri beneath dozens of feet of volcanic tephra, perfectly preserving its two-story homes, stone staircases, and vivid wall frescoes for modern archaeologists. The true devastation of the Thera eruption, however, was delivered across the surrounding waters by a series of monstrous tsunamis generated by the collapse of the volcanic caldera into the ocean. Towering walls of water, estimated to have exceeded 40 feet in height, raced southward across the Aegean, slamming into the northern coast of Crete within an hour. The tsunamis annihilated the Minoan coastal ports, smashed their naval and merchant fleets to splinters, and flooded prime agricultural lowlands with toxic salt water. Thick clouds of volcanic ash drifted across the eastern Mediterranean, blocking out the sun, triggering localized temperature drops, and contaminating freshwater springs and pastures with toxic fluorine. Though the great palace of Knossos survived the initial shock, the economic and logistical backbone of the Minoan maritime empire was permanently broken. Deprived of their ships, their coastal trade, and their agricultural security, the weakened Minoans fell easy prey a generation later to the militaristic Mycenaean Greeks who invaded from the mainland. Following the fall of the Minoans, the eastern Mediterranean and Near East stabilized into a golden age of hyper-connected, international globalization during the Late Bronze Age. Between 1500 and 1200 years before the Common Era, a sophisticated network of great powers, the New Kingdom of Egypt, the Hittite Empire of Anatolia, the Kassite Kingdom of Babylon, the Middle Assyrian Empire, the Kingdom of Mitanni, and the Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece, lived in a tense, balanced state of international diplomacy and high-volume trade. The rulers of these superpowers referred to each other as brother in diplomatic letters inscribed on cuneiform clay tablets discovered at Amarna in Egypt and Hattusa in Turkey. They exchanged royal gifts of gold, silver, lapis lazuli, horses, and dynastic brides, while state-sponsored merchant ships transported massive cargoes of raw materials across international waters. The lifeblood of this entire Late Bronze Age global economy was an intricate, fragile metallurgical axis centered on the production of bronze. Bronze was the essential industrial material of the ancient world, required for manufacturing everything from military swords, spear points, and body armor to agricultural sickles, carpentry axes, and ship-building nails. Yet bronze is an alloy that requires two distinct metals in a precise ratio, roughly 90% copper and 10% tin. While copper was abundant and easily mined on the Mediterranean island of Cyprus, giving the island its very name, tin was extraordinarily rare and geographically isolated. The great bronze-producing empires had to import tin across thousands of miles of hazardous overland caravan routes from the mountains of modern-day Afghanistan, or through perilous maritime voyages to the far-flung shores of Cornwall in Britain. This meant that the entire geopolitical architecture of the Late Bronze Age rested on a razor's edge of supply chain vulnerability. If a single mountain pass was blocked by bandits, if a strategic strait was closed by pirates, or if a key transit kingdom collapsed, the entire international tin trade ground to a screeching halt. Without tin, smelters could not produce bronze. Without bronze, armies could not rearm their soldiers, farmers could not harvest their fields efficiently, and empires could not maintain their military supremacy. The system was so tightly coupled and hyper-specialized that it possessed no resilience against widespread systemic shocks. It was a civilization optimized for peace and predictable trade, completely unequipped to withstand a cascade of simultaneous crises. Around 1200 years before the Common Era, that catastrophic cascade arrived with the force of an unstoppable apocalypse, the Late Bronze Age collapse. Within the span of a single generation, virtually every major city and palace between the Greek mainland and the borders of Egypt was systematically sacked, burned, and permanently erased from the map. The mighty Mycenaean citadels of Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos were reduced to smoking ruins. The fortified Hittite capital of Hattusa was burned to the ground. The rich mercantile metropolis of Ugarit on the Syrian coast was annihilated, and the urban centers of the Levant were leveled in fire. Out of the great empires that had dominated the civilized world for centuries, only Egypt managed to survive, but it was left permanently crippled, impoverished, and fractured. For centuries, historians debated the cause of this sudden civilizational collapse, blaming it on mysterious invasions of barbarian hordes known from Egyptian inscriptions as the Sea Peoples. Modern paleoclimatology, high-resolution pollen data, and speleothem records from Mediterranean caves have revealed that the true catalyst was a devastating, multi-century megadrought that gripped the entire eastern Mediterranean basin around 1200 BC. Temperatures rose sharply while winter rainfall plummeted, triggering widespread agricultural failures that lasted for over 300 consecutive years. In the royal archives of Hattusa and Ugarit, excavators have recovered desperate clay tablets written by the last kings in the final days before their cities burned. One letter from the Hittite court cries out, "Do you not know that there was a famine in the midst of my lands? It is a matter of life and death." Another frantic tablet from the king of Ugarit reports that his own troops and naval fleet had been sent away to defend distant borders, leaving his coastal capital completely undefended as the enemy's ships approached. The crippling drought triggered massive, cascading food shortages that displaced entire populations across Europe and the Mediterranean basin. Starving tribes from the Aegean Islands, the Balkans, Sicily, and Sardinia banded together into mobile, desperate confederations of maritime raiders, the Sea Peoples. Armed with new, lightweight slashing swords and javelins, these displaced warrior families sailed in longboats along the coasts, raiding urban granaries, burning vulnerable ports, and severing the critical maritime tin and copper trade routes. Simultaneously, the eastern Mediterranean was struck by a severe earthquake storm, a geological sequence where major tectonic ruptures occurred along the North Anatolian and Dead Sea fault lines over several decades, toppling the defensive stone walls of cities like Troy, Mycenae, and Jericho. Battered by mega-drought, starved by crop failure, shaken by earthquakes, and cut off from metal trade, the hyper-specialized Late Bronze Age kingdoms imploded under the weight of their own internal fragility. The collapse of the Bronze Age was a catastrophe of unimaginable magnitude, plunging the ancient world into centuries of economic darkness, depopulation, and illiteracy. The complex scribal scripts of the era, such as the Mycenaean Linear B, were forgotten entirely as the palaces that employed the scribes burned to the ground. Yet within this smoking ruin of imperial hubris lay the seeds of humanity's next great evolutionary leap forward. Deprived of imported tin to make bronze, blacksmiths in the eastern Mediterranean were forced by absolute necessity to turn their attention to a common, stubborn, and previously unworkable metal, iron. Iron ores were abundant in almost every hillside, but working iron required vastly higher kiln temperatures, specialized charcoal fuel, and labor-intensive hammering to expel impurities. Out of the ashes of the Bronze Age, the iron furnace was born, democratizing metal technology and stripping centralized imperial elites of their monopoly over tools and weapons. The destruction of the great palatial empires also opened the Mediterranean shipping lanes to small, agile, and decentralized societies that had previously lived on the imperial margins. Along the rocky coast of modern Lebanon, the Canaanite survivors of the collapse regrouped in coastal city-states like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, transforming themselves into the greatest seafarers in human history, the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians discarded the cumbersome, elite-controlled cuneiform and hieroglyphic writing systems, inventing a radical, simplified 22-letter phonetic alphabet that any merchant or sailor could learn in a matter of weeks. They built nimble cedarwood merchant galleys, sailed through the Straits of Gibraltar into the wild Atlantic Ocean, and founded vibrant trading colonies across North Africa and Iberia, including the mighty city of Carthage. Humanity did not freeze in the dark when the great Bronze Age empires crumbled. Instead, we decentralized our power, simplified our technologies, democratized our languages, and took to the open sea. The lesson etched into every layer of ash at Hattusa, Ugarit, and Mycenae remains one of the most urgent warnings from deep human history. Civilizations do not fall because their people suddenly lose their intelligence or their courage. They fall when their social and economic structures become too rigid, too specialized, and too detached from their ecological foundations. The Bronze Age kings built colossal stone walls to keep out their enemies, but they could not build a wall high enough to keep out the drought, the famine, and the systemic failure of their trade networks. Yet through every collapse, the fundamental genius of our species has always been our ability to abandon the broken monuments of the past and reinvent how we live. The collapse of the old world cleared the stage for the classical age of philosophy, democracy, iron tools, and alphabetic literacy, proving that the end of an empire is never the end of the human story. As the Iron Age consolidated the power of organized states, humanity entered a temporary golden age dictated by the calmest planetary conditions in thousands of years. Between roughly 300 years before the Common Era and 200 years into the Common Era, the Northern Hemisphere enjoyed a period of remarkable warmth, stability, and abundant rainfall known to science as the Roman climate optimum. Across the Mediterranean basin, summer temperatures rose to levels comparable to modern times, while winter storms delivered reliable moisture deep into the arid frontiers of North Africa and the Near East. Olive trees and vineyards were planted hundreds of miles north of their modern agricultural limits, flourishing along the misty hills of northern Roman Britain and the river valleys of the Rhine. This prolonged meteorological stability created the illusion that human imperial power, rather than planetary benevolence, was responsible for the unprecedented prosperity of the classical world. Behind the majestic marble facades of Rome's imperial forum lay an agricultural machine of terrifying scale and relentless consumption. To feed a metropolitan population exceeding 1 million citizens, the Roman state established the Annona, a massive state-directed logistics network that transported hundreds of thousands of tons of wheat annually across the Mediterranean. The true heart of this empire was not the Italian peninsula, but the sun-drenched, well-watered coastal plains of Roman North Africa and the inexhaustible alluvial fields of the Nile Delta. Mighty fleets of broad-beamed grain freighters sailed continuously between Alexandria, Carthage, and Rome's artificial seaport of Portus, tying the survival of the imperial capital to distant agricultural yields. Roman engineers blanketed entire provinces in terraced olive groves, paved military highways, and colossal stone aqueducts that transported millions of gallons of mountain spring water directly into municipal bathhouses and fountains. Yet beneath this outward display of engineering mastery, the Roman Empire was systematically exhausting the natural ecosystems upon which its wealth was founded. To smelt millions of tons of Spanish silver, copper, and iron, to construct vast naval armadas, and to heat the opulent hypocaust floors of Roman villas, entire old-growth forests across Spain, Italy, Greece, and Gaul were leveled to the ground. Geologists drilling deep into the Greenland ice sheet have uncovered a distinct, continuous spike of lead and copper atmospheric pollution that mirrors the economic output of the Roman mining industry with startling precision. Deforestation stripped the thin Mediterranean topsoil from mountain slopes, causing catastrophic soil erosion that choked river mouths with silt, turned former harbor cities like Ephesus into inland ruins, and created vast, malarial coastal swamps. Rome's economic strength was built by mortgaging the ecological capital of its conquered territories, creating an agricultural system pushed to its absolute physical limit. Simultaneously, across the vast continental plains of Eastern Asia, the Han dynasty was riding the very same wave of mid-Holocene climatic warmth to forge China's golden age of imperial unification. Under the Western Han, stable monsoon rains and warm summer temperatures allowed agricultural yields to skyrocket, supporting a population of over 60 million people centered along the fertile plains of the Yellow and Huai rivers. Han emperors expanded state-managed irrigation networks, mobilized millions of conscripted peasants to dig massive shipping canals, and established the revolutionary Tunshan system of military agricultural colonies. To protect their borders against the nomadic horsemen of the north, the Han pushed their frontiers deep into the arid Hushi corridor, constructing thousands of watchtowers and beacon stations along the newly forged Silk Road. This transcontinental trade network flourished precisely because melting alpine glaciers in the Tian Shan and Kunlun Mountains fed a chain of vibrant, well-watered desert oases that allowed caravans to cross the barren Taklamakan Desert. To protect their agrarian society against the inevitable return of bad weather, the Han bureaucracy instituted the brilliant, ever-normal granary system. During years of bumper harvests and low grain prices, imperial officials purchased massive surpluses of millet and rice with state funds, storing millions of bushels in towering, fortified municipal silos. When droughts, locust swarms, or floods struck a province, the state released this stored grain at regulated, affordable prices, preventing famine-induced insurrections and stabilizing the rural economy. This was a profound conceptual evolution in statecraft, the recognition that an empire's ultimate duty was to act as an artificial buffer between human biology and atmospheric instability. For over 2 centuries, the ever-normal granaries held the empire together, proving that administrative planning and grain reserves were more powerful defenses against collapse than standing armies. While the Old World built its empires along great river valleys, an entirely different hydraulic civilization was rising within the dense, tropical rainforests of Mesoamerica, the classic Maya. Occupying the karst limestone plateau of modern-day Guatemala, Belize, southern Mexico, and Honduras, the Maya built a radiant network of rival city-states like Tikal, Calakmul, Palenque, and Copan without access to metal tools, draft animals, or permanent river systems. The limestone bedrock of the Maya lowlands was porous like a giant sponge, causing rainwater to drain almost instantly into deep subterranean caverns, leaving the surface parched for months during the annual dry season. To survive in this deceptively challenging environment, Maya engineers transformed the rainforest floor into a vast, artificial water harvesting landscape. They paved public plazas with impermeable plaster to funnel millions of gallons of rainwater into colossal, clay-lined reservoirs known as aguadas, capable of sustaining entire urban populations through the dry months. In rural households, families carved bottle-shaped underground storage cisterns called chultans directly into the limestone rock, coating the interiors with waterproof lime stucco to preserve fresh drinking water for individual family compounds. To feed city populations that reached densities comparable to modern agricultural landscapes, Maya farmers converted seasonal swamps, or bajos, into extensive systems of raised and channelized fields. By digging deep drainage canals and piling the nutrient-rich organic muck onto elevated agricultural beds, they created self-fertilizing fields that yielded multiple harvests of maize, beans, squash, and cacao each year. Water was not merely a physical resource for the Maya. It was the foundation of their entire sacred cosmology and royal legitimacy. Kings were revered as divine intermediaries who donned jade jewelry and performed elaborate bloodletting rituals to summon Shak, the fearsome rain god whose lightning axe cracked the sky to water the earth. Yet the Maya built an agricultural and demographic pyramid that was fatally over-leveraged against the carrying capacity of their fragile tropical soils. To produce the vast quantities of lime plaster required to coat their soaring pyramid temples, grand plazas, and royal palaces, Maya laborers burned millions of acres of surrounding rainforest to fuel their lime kilns, requiring 5 tons of green timber for every single ton of plaster produced. Deforestation disrupted the localized hydrological cycle, reducing atmospheric moisture recycling and raising local surface temperatures. Beginning in the 8th century of the Common Era, the Mesoamerican monsoon system was struck by a series of catastrophic, multi-decadal megadroughts, as revealed by titanium concentration records from the Carayaco Basin and stalagmite layers in Belize caves. The rains failed year after year. The great clay-lined reservoirs dried into cracked mud, the raised wetland fields withered, and the water table dropped far below the reach of human tools. The resulting collapse of the classic Maya was swift, violent, and absolute across the southern lowlands. Deprived of water and food, the divine authority of the kings disintegrated, triggering decades of brutal, desperate endemic warfare between rival city-states fighting over the remaining functional water holes. Defensive walls were thrown up in haste through the middle of once sacred plazas, Monuments were left half-carved in stone quarries, and royal palaces were burned to the ground by starving populations. Millions of people either perished from famine and waterborne diseases or abandoned the great urban centers entirely, scattering into the northern highlands and the coastal fringes of the Yucatan Peninsula. Within a century, the monumental stone pyramids of Tikal and Calakmul were completely swallowed by the encroaching jungle canopy, buried beneath thick roots until modern satellite lasers pierced the forest to reveal the drowned ghosts of an over-engineered civilization. High in the southern hemisphere, an equally astonishing hydraulic civilization was mastering survival in one of the most extreme environments on Earth, the high-altitude Altiplano around Lake Titicaca. Situated 12,500 feet above sea level in the windswept Andes of modern-day Bolivia, the city of Tiwanaku flourished as a monumental ceremonial metropolis constructed from colossal, precision-carved andesite megaliths weighing up to 100 tons. At this breathtaking altitude, agriculture was an extreme hazard. Thin air, intense daytime solar radiation, and sudden nighttime frost could freeze and kill delicate crops within hours. To overcome this ecological barrier, Tiwanaku engineers invented the Sucakalu, a sophisticated system of raised agricultural platforms alternating with deep, wide water canals. During the intense sunlight of the day, the water in the canals absorbed immense amounts of solar thermal energy. At night, as temperatures plunged below freezing, the warm water slowly released this heat into the air, creating an artificial thermal blanket that insulated the elevated potato and quinoa crops from the killing frost. The canals also served as massive aquaculture ponds, breeding edible fish and accumulating rich aquatic vegetation that was dredged up annually to fertilize the raised fields. This microclimatic engineering allowed Tiwanaku to support over 50,000 people in a high-altitude plain that modern agriculture struggles to farm. Yet when a multi-century Andean mega-drought struck the continent in the 11th century, the water level of Lake Titicaca plummeted by over 30 feet, cutting off the inflow channels that sustained the canal networks. Deprived of their protective water thermal barrier, the Sucakalu fields froze, agricultural yields collapsed, and the centralized Tiwanaku state disintegrated into smaller, decentralized pastoral communities herding alpacas and llamas across the Puna. Back in the Mediterranean, the benign climate of the Roman climate optimum was beginning to fracture into unpredictable volatility by the late 2nd century of the Common Era. Solar irradiance fluctuated, atmospheric circulation shifted, and a sequence of volcanic eruptions in the tropics injected reflective aerosols into the stratosphere, triggering widespread temperature drops and irregular rainfall. Agricultural yields began to decline across Italy and Gaul, leaving populations undernourished and far more biologically susceptible to infectious diseases. It was into this ecologically stressed, hyper-connected Mediterranean world that the first great global pandemic struck, the Antonine Plague of 165 CE. Believed by modern epidemiologists to have been an early, virulent strain of smallpox, the disease was brought back from the Near East by Roman legions returning from the Parthian War. The very infrastructure that made the Roman Empire great, its paved military roads, bustling commercial ports, and tightly packed urban centers, now functioned as an interconnected biological highway for the pathogen. The plague swept through the empire like an inferno, killing an estimated 5 to 10 million people, including the co-emperor Lucius Verus, and devastating the legions stationed along the Rhine and Danube frontiers. Entire agricultural districts were depopulated, tax revenues collapsed, and the imperial army was forced to recruit slaves, gladiators, and barbarian mercenaries to fill the depleted ranks. A century later, before the empire could fully recover, the plague of Cyprian struck in 249 CE, causing widespread social panic, economic paralysis, and the near-total collapse of the Mediterranean monetary system. The combination of cooling climate, agricultural decline, and devastating biological shocks plunged the Roman world into the chaotic 3rd century crisis, fundamentally shattering the Pax Romana. This period of environmental degradation in the Mediterranean coincided with a profound ecological crisis unfolding across the Great Eurasian Steppe. Stretching for over 5,000 miles from the plains of Manchuria to the Puszta of Hungary, The Eurasian steppe is an ocean of grass whose carrying capacity is entirely governed by subtle shifts in annual precipitation. When the rains are plentiful, the steppe blossoms with rich grasses that can support millions of horses, sheep, and cattle, fueling the population growth of nomadic pastoralist confederations. When multi-year droughts strike, the grass withers, watering holes vanish under shifting sands, and pastoralist economies face immediate, catastrophic collapse. Tree ring data and lake sediment cores from Central Asia demonstrate that during the 4th century of the Common Era, the steppe was struck by an unprecedented, prolonged megadrought that triggered a massive ecological domino effect across Eurasia. Faced with the starvation of their herds, pastoralist tribes had only one path of survival: to pack their felt yurts, mount their horses, and migrate violently westward toward the wetter, greener margins of Europe and China. From the eastern steppes, the Xiongnu pushed westward, giving rise to the fearsome nomadic confederation known to Western history as the Huns. Riding swift, compact steppe ponies and wielding composite recurve bows capable of piercing armor at extreme distances, the Huns swept into the plains north of the Black Sea with devastating speed. Their arrival acted as a biological and military shockwave, driving the displaced Gothic, Vandal, Swabi, and Alan tribes directly against the fortified borders of the Roman Empire. Starving, desperate, and accompanied by their entire families, hundreds of thousands of Germanic refugees massed along the frozen banks of the Danube River in 376 CE, demanding land, food, and asylum. When corrupt Roman officials exploited the refugees by forcing them to sell their own children into slavery in exchange for rancid dog meat, the desperate Goths rose in open rebellion. In 378 CE, at the catastrophic Battle of Adrianople, the Gothic cavalry annihilated the Eastern Roman field army and killed the Emperor Valens on the battlefield, shattering the myth of Roman military invincibility. Over the following century, wave after wave of displaced barbarian confederations poured across the freezing Rhine and Danube rivers, carving out their own kingdoms across Gaul, Spain, and North Africa. The western provinces of the Roman Empire were not conquered by an organized military plan, but were overwhelmed by a systemic migration of human populations fleeing the environmental desolation of the drying Eurasian steppe. In 410 CE, the Visigoths under Alaric sacked Rome itself, and by 476 CE, the last Western Roman emperor was deposed, bringing an end to over a millennium of imperial dominion. Yet the greatest environmental cataclysm of the ancient world was still to come, an event so apocalyptic that it wiped out sunlight across 3 continents and plunged the planet into an era of terrifying cold and biological ruin. In the year 536 of the Common Era, a catastrophic volcanic eruption, likely located in high-latitude Iceland or North America, followed closely by a massive tropical eruption at Ilopango in El Salvador, injected a colossal veil of sulfur dioxide and ash into the stratosphere. For over 18 continuous months, a dense, dry, and impenetrable blue fog shrouded the skies of Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia, blocking out the solar radiation. The contemporary Roman historian Procopius recorded the horror with chilling clarity, writing that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during this whole year, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse. In Constantinople and Rome, the midday sun cast no shadows, the air remained bitterly cold throughout the summer, and the stars were invisible at night. In China, historical chronicles record that summer snows fell in the 8th month, devastating crops, causing severe frosts in southern provinces, and triggering famines so extreme that millions of people died of starvation. In Europe, the decade following 536 CE was the coldest recorded in the last 2,000 years, initiating a protracted period of global climatic cooling known as the Late Antique Little Ice Age. Tree rings across the northern hemisphere show near-zero growth, indicating that the photosynthetic engine of the planet had essentially stalled. Crops rotted in freezing, rain-soaked fields, wild fruits failed to ripen, and livestock froze to death in their pens. For an agrarian world that possessed no modern food reserves and was already reeling from political fragmentation, this sudden atmospheric blackout was an existential catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. Then, at the absolute lowest point of human resilience, when famine-weakened bodies were crowded into freezing cities, the ultimate biological horror struck, the Justinian plague. Originating in the high-altitude rodent reservoirs of Central Asia or Central Africa, the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the causative agent of the bubonic plague, traveled along international trade routes to the Roman grain port of Pelusium on the eastern edge of the Nile Delta. From there, black rats carrying plague-infected fleas boarded the imperial grain freighters sailing toward the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, Constantinople. In the summer of 541 CE, the plague erupted within the packed, impoverished neighborhoods of the imperial metropolis with apocalyptic fury. The disease attacked the lymphatic system of its victims, causing agonizing, necrotic swellings called buboes in the groin, armpits, and neck, followed by internal hemorrhaging, delirium, and rapid death within days. At the height of the epidemic, contemporary chroniclers reported that up to 10,000 people died every single day in Constantinople alone, overwhelming the city's ability to bury its dead. Public cemeteries were filled to capacity, forcing officials to dig massive mass graves across the hills of Galata and fill the fortified defensive towers along the city walls to the brim with decomposing corpses. The imperial bureaucracy paralyzed, food distribution networks collapsed, and the Emperor Justinian himself contracted the disease, though he narrowly survived after days of fever and delirium. The plague swept across the entire Mediterranean basin and Europe in successive waves for over 2 centuries, killing an estimated 25 to 50 million people, or nearly half the population of the civilized Western world. Fields were left unharvested, villages were abandoned to the wolves, and the economic backbone of the Eastern Roman Empire was permanently broken. The convergence of the 536 atmospheric dust veil, the late antique Little Ice Age, and the Justinian plague fundamentally redrew the geopolitical map of the world. Justinian's grand imperial dream of reconquering the lost Western Roman provinces and reuniting the Mediterranean basin was extinguished forever in the ashes of biological and climatic catastrophe. The devastated, depopulated landscapes of the Balkans were rapidly settled by migrating Slavic tribes who crossed the undefended Danube frontier to establish new agrarian communities. In the Arabian Peninsula, where the cooler, wetter conditions of the 6th century temporarily enhanced the productivity of desert oases and trade routes, a new cultural and spiritual power was coalescing. Deeply unified under a radical new monotheistic vision and largely untouched by the maritime-borne plague that devastated the urban Mediterranean, the Arab armies of the early Islamic caliphates swept out of the desert in the 7th century, shattering the exhausted Byzantine and Sasanian empires and forging a glorious new civilization from the Atlantic to the borders of India. Looking back across the trials of classical antiquity and late antiquity, the profound lesson of human vulnerability to planetary systems becomes unshakable. The greatest empires of human memory, Rome, Han China, the classic Maya, and Tiwanaku, did not rise solely through the brilliance of their laws, the genius of their engineers, or the iron discipline of their legions. They rose because the planetary climate provided a temporary window of warmth, stability, and predictable rain. But when the atmospheric engines shifted, when the mega-droughts dried the canals, when the steppe grasses withered, when the volcanoes blotted out the sun, and when the plague bacteria jumped into our logistics networks, the colossal stone monuments of our ancestors could not save them. Yet through the fall of Rome, the burning of Maya temples, the freezing years of 536, and the horror of the plague, humanity never surrendered its will to endure. The survivors adapted, decentralized their power, preserved their knowledge in monasteries and desert libraries, and planted the resilient seeds of the medieval and modern world. When the darkness of the late antique Little Ice Age finally lifted, the planet once again exhaled warmth across the northern hemisphere, and humanity responded as it always had, by expanding into every corner the good weather opened. Between roughly 900 and 1200 years of the Common Era, a period now called the medieval climate anomaly settled over much of the world. Summers lengthened across Europe, harvests swelled, and populations doubled. Cathedrals climbed into the sky over fields that had never been so generous, while farmers plowed high mountain valleys and Scandinavian hillsides that had lain frozen and useless for generations. It was in this window of borrowed warmth that the most audacious voyages of the medieval world were launched, when Norse sailors, riding winds off a forgiving North Atlantic, pushed their open wooden ships beyond the edge of every map their people had ever known. From Norway they sailed to Iceland, and from Iceland to a land of glaciers and green coastal meadows they named Greenland, a name chosen with a merchant's cunning to attract settlers to a frontier that was far colder than it sounded. For centuries, Norse colonies clung to the southwestern fjords of Greenland, herding cattle and sheep, hunting seals, building stone churches, and trading ivory with Europe. Eric the Red's descendants even reached the coasts of North America, 5 centuries before Columbus, landing at a place they called Vinland. The Norse world stretched from Newfoundland to the Volga, a network of trade and settlement woven entirely out of a temporary kindness in the climate. But the settlers of Greenland never understood what the elder beside the shrinking African lake had understood 100,000 years before them, that no kindness in the sky is permanent, and that the truest skill of survival is knowing when the world you know has begun to end. The same warm centuries that carried the Vikings westward were quietly starving civilizations in the American Southwest. At Chaco Canyon, deep in the deserts of what is now New Mexico, the ancestral Puebloans had raised a ceremonial world of enormous sandstone great houses, some standing 5 stories tall, with over 600 rooms, connected by engineered roads that ran arrow straight for dozens of miles across the desert floor. This improbable urban center, home to thousands in a land without rivers, depended on careful dryland farming of maize, beans, and squash, nourished by summer monsoon rains funneled through clever checked dams and grid gardens. But tree rings recovered from the ancient Vegas of those great houses tell a story of terrible patience. Beginning in the 12th century, the Southwest was struck by megadroughts of a severity unseen in the previous 1,000 years. One of them, around the year 1130, lasted nearly 30 years without relief. The corn withered, the springs went silent, and the elaborate social order of Chaco dissolved. Families walked away from the great houses forever, carrying their knowledge south and east, where their descendants, the Pueblo peoples, rebuilt life on a smaller, humbler, more durable scale. They had learned the oldest lesson in the human library. When the ceremonial center can no longer be fed, it must be abandoned, and the people must live on. Far to the east, along the muddy confluence of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, the great city of Cahokia was learning the same lesson at the same moment. The largest urban center north of Mesoamerica, Cahokia housed more than 10,000 people around monumental earthen pyramids, the greatest of which, Monk's Mound, rose 100 feet above the floodplain on a base larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Its people raised solar calendars of towering cedar posts, feasted on deer and corn, and buried their elites with sacrificed retainers and copper ornaments. But around the year 1150, drought seized the American heartland. Corn harvests faltered, political authority fractured, and the city emptied within a generation, leaving the mounds to the grass and the silence. No invasion destroyed Cahokia, no enemy burned it. The rain simply left, and the people followed it. On the far side of the Pacific, the greatest hydraulic city on Earth met the same teacher. Angkor, capital of the Khmer Empire in the jungles of Cambodia, was a water city without parallel, its vast low-density urban landscape spreading across nearly 1,000 square kilometers. Its engineers had reshaped the entire watershed, building hundreds of square kilometers of reservoirs, canals, embankments, and temple moats, crowned by the magnificent temple mountain of Angkor Wat. The entire system was tuned like an instrument to the rhythm of the monsoon, capturing summer floodwaters and releasing them across the dry season rice paddies. But the sediment layers beneath the city record a catastrophe of whiplash. First came decades of violent monsoon flooding in the 14th century, overwhelming the canals and choking them with silt. Then, cruelly, the monsoon failed entirely, and a devastating megadrought settled over Southeast Asia. A water city built for abundance had no defense against too much water followed by too little. The hydraulic network collapsed, the elites scattered, and the jungle slowly climbed the walls of Angkor Wat, wrapping the greatest religious monument on earth in roots and silence. And then the cold came back. Beginning in the late 13th century and deepening for 400 years, the northern hemisphere slid into the Little Ice Age, the coldest sustained period since the age of the Great Glaciers retreat. Solar activity weakened, volcanic eruptions stacked one upon another, and pack ice began creeping south into the North Atlantic. In Greenland, the sea lanes closed, the pastures shortened, and the hay that fed the cattle through the long polar winters failed year after year. The Norse there had adapted to many things, but they were farmers and Christians in a world turning Arctic, unwilling or unable to become fully like the Inuit, who hunted seal and whale through the ice and thrived in the very decades that starved the Europeans. Sometime in the 15th century, the last Norse Greenlanders vanished, leaving behind a church, some iron tools, and the bones of cattle they had refused to stop loving to the very end. The Little Ice Age did not spare Europe either. Beginning in 1315, 3 years of relentless cold rain rotted every harvest from Ireland to Poland, unleashing the Great Famine, in which millions died and reports spread of the desperate eating things no human should eat. A generation later, famine weakened and crowded. Europe received the second great visitation of Yersinia pestis, the Black Death, which killed perhaps one person in every 3 between the Atlantic and the Volga. Yet here, at the edge of the story, something remarkable must be noticed. The Black Death, for all its horror, shattered the rigid medieval order of serfdom. Labor became precious, survivors bargained for wages, revolts questioned ancient hierarchies, and from the wreckage rose the restless, questioning world that would produce the Renaissance, the age of exploration, and eventually the scientific revolution. Even in catastrophe, the old pattern held. Humanity took the blow, absorbed it, reorganized, and changed. And this, finally, is where the thread of our story reaches the present day. Consider everything this journey has passed through. We stood beside a lake in Africa as it dried and watched a small band weigh memory against the unknown. We crossed the mammoth steppe with the eyed needle and the bone-burning hearth. We watched the sky darken after Toba, watched the ice swallow the north, watched the sea drown the plains where children had slept. We saw the Sahara bloom green and wither again, saw the first seeds of wheat saved from a drying Levant, saw pyramids rise because refugees had no choice, and saw empires crack when the rain belts moved a few degrees. We watched Thera explode, watched the Bronze Age unravel for want of tin, watched Rome feed 1 million mouths on borrowed African rain, watched the Maya kings fail to conjure water, watched the Huns ride ahead of a starving steppe, and watched the year 536 pass without a proper sun. We watched Chaco empty, Cahokia empty, Angkor drown in dust, and the last Norse farmer in Greenland close his door against the cold. Through all of it, one truth never changed. Every human being alive today is descended exclusively from the ones who noticed, remembered, cooperated, and moved. We are not the descendants of the strongest. They died defending territories that no longer existed. We are not the descendants of the most stubborn. They starved beside sacred lakes that had become salt flats. We are the descendants of the ones who watched the world change and changed with it, who stored the old stories even while learning new skills, who welcomed strangers carrying news of distant water, who wrapped their children in sewn hides and walked into the unknown. Every comfort of the modern world, every city, every field, every alphabet and vaccine and satellite, grew out of that ancient habit of adaptation. The people who built our world were, first and always, climate survivors. The sky remains what it always was, the oldest and most powerful force in the human story. It dried the lakes that sent us walking. It froze the plains that taught us to sow. It buried the landscapes we still search for beneath the sea. And it ended every empire that mistook a favorable season for a permanent blessing. Our ancestors never conquered it. They survived it by staying humble, staying flexible, and staying together. That inheritance is the oldest technology we possess, older than the needle, older than fire, passed down through 100,000 years of conversation beside 100,000 fires. Somewhere, deep in our memories, the small band still walks away from the shrinking lake, an elder's voice guiding them toward a spring she saw only once in childhood. They do not know they are beginning the human story. They are only doing what humans do, paying attention, holding on to each other, and moving toward water. And as long as we remember their lesson, that no map is permanent, no way of life is final, and no generation can afford to stop adapting, the story they began will never truly end. It simply continues, now with us.